There are some books that comfort us by confirming what we already suspect, and there are other books that unsettle us by challenging the way we explain our own lives. The Courage to be Disliked belongs firmly in the second category. It is a book that begins with an almost offensive suggestion. Perhaps you are not as trapped as you think. Perhaps your past, while real and painful, does not hold as much absolute power over your present as you have been led to believe. Perhaps a large portion of your suffering comes not from what happened to you, but from the way you continue to position yourself in relation to other people, their approval, and your own fear. This is one reason the book has had such a wide impact. It does not speak in the soft language of reassurance. It does not tell readers that all their patterns are understandable and therefore fixed. Instead, it offers a demanding kind of hope. It says that freedom is possible, but freedom has a cost. That cost is responsibility. That cost is uncertainty. That cost is the willingness to be misunderstood. Written by Ichiro Kishimi and Fumitake Koga, the book introduces the ideas of Alfred Adler through a dialogue between a philosopher and a young man. The structure matters. This is not a dry summary of psychological principles. It is an argument. The young man is skeptical, frustrated, and emotionally invested in proving that the philosopher is wrong. He believes people are shaped by trauma, that society is unfair, and that most suffering comes from external limitations and wounds from the past. The philosopher responds with an entirely different framework, one that says human beings are far more capable of changing than they usually believe. As we move through this summary, we will explore the central claims of the book, the logic behind them, the emotional resistance they provoke, and the practical lessons that emerge. We will look at why Adlerian psychology rejects the tyranny of the past, why approval-seeking becomes a prison, why relationships are often the hidden source of our unhappiness, and why contribution matters more than comparison. Above all, we will explore the central challenge of the book itself. What does it really mean to live with the courage to be disliked? The first thing to understand about this book is that its form is part of its message. Instead of presenting a neat set of tips or a step-by-step formula, the authors stage a confrontation between two worldviews. The young man represents a common modern perspective. He sees life through the lens of cause and effect. If someone is anxious, there must be a reason in the past. If someone is unsuccessful, perhaps they were damaged, neglected, or disadvantaged in ways that now define their capacity. If a person feels inferior, then maybe reality itself has placed them in a position where confidence is impossible. The philosopher introduces a radically different interpretation rooted in Adlerian psychology. He argues that people do not simply act because of past causes. They act in pursuit of present purposes. This is a crucial shift. It means that instead of asking only, "What happened to this person?" Adler asks, "What is this person trying to accomplish through this behavior right now?" That may sound abstract at first, but it has dramatic implications. If someone says, "I cannot speak in public because I had a humiliating experience years ago," the usual interpretation is that the past event caused a lasting wound. Adlerian thinking does not deny that the event happened or that it was painful. But it asks a more unsettling question. Does avoiding public speaking now serve a purpose? Does it protect the person from risk, embarrassment, responsibility, or the possibility of failure? The book insists that many of our limitations are not passive injuries we simply carry around. They are active strategies, often unconscious, that help us avoid difficult tasks in the present. This is why the philosopher says that people can change. Not because change is easy, and not because suffering is imaginary, but because the self is not merely a container of past damage. It is an active way of living. From the beginning, then, the book asks the reader to let go of one deeply familiar comfort, the comfort of explanation without action. If the past completely determines us, then we can always say, "This is why I am the way I am." But if our current life patterns are connected to goals we are still choosing, then the uncomfortable possibility emerges that we are more involved in our own unhappiness than we would like to admit. One of the most discussed and controversial parts of The Courage to be Disliked is its treatment of trauma and the past. The philosopher rejects what he calls the trauma perspective, meaning the idea that human beings are fundamentally determined by past wounds. This is one of the moments when the young man reacts with the greatest resistance, and many readers do too. It can sound as if the book is dismissing pain or denying the seriousness of difficult experiences. But its deeper point is not that suffering is unreal. Its point is that suffering should not become a permanent explanation for why growth is impossible. The philosopher argues that people often use the past as a story that justifies the present. This story can become extremely powerful. Someone may say, "I was rejected before, so of course I avoid closeness." Or, "I was humiliated as a child, so naturally I lack confidence." These statements feel true because they connect real events to current behaviors. But Adlerian psychology asks whether these behaviors may also serve a present goal. Avoiding closeness may protect a person from vulnerability. Lacking confidence may protect them from the risk of trying and failing. In other words, the present pattern may be maintained because it is useful, even if it is painful. This is a demanding idea because it removes some of the innocence from our self-explanations. We prefer to think of our limitations as things that simply happen to us. The book suggests that, very often, we participate in preserving them. Not because we are bad or dishonest, but because familiar suffering can feel safer than uncertain freedom. The philosopher does not claim that change happens through denial. He does not say, "Forget your past and move on." Instead, he says that the meaning of the past is not fixed. What matters is not only what happened, but what purpose you continue to assign to it in the present. A painful memory can become a reason to withdraw from life, or it can become one part of a larger story that no longer rules your identity. This is where the book becomes strangely hopeful. If the past is not destiny, then a person is not required to wait for perfect healing before beginning to live differently. One does not need to erase every fear in order to act. One does not need to settle every inner conflict before choosing a new direction. Change begins not with total emotional certainty, but with willingness. It begins with the decision to stop using old pain as the final answer to every present challenge. This perspective can feel severe, but it also restores agency. It says that while we cannot choose what has happened, we can choose the meaning and use we give it now. And that is the foundation for everything else the book tries to teach. To understand the book more deeply, it helps to focus on one philosophical distinction at the center of Adler's thought: causality versus teleology. Causality asks what caused this behavior. Teleology asks what goal this behavior serves. The philosopher repeatedly returns to this idea because it changes how we interpret almost every human pattern. Imagine a person who gets angry very quickly. A causal explanation might say they are like this because of stress, because of their upbringing, because of pressure at work, or because they have always had a short temper. Adlerian thinking does not completely ignore those influences, but it looks at what anger accomplishes. Does it intimidate others? Does it help the person avoid responsibility? Does it restore a temporary sense of control? In this sense, anger may function less as an unavoidable force and more as a tool. This is not meant as a moral accusation. The point is not that people are consciously calculating every emotional reaction. The point is that behavior has direction. It is not random. It organizes itself around goals such as avoiding shame, gaining power, protecting self-image, securing attention, or escaping difficult tasks. Once you begin looking at life this way, many familiar patterns appear differently. Procrastination may not simply be laziness. It may be a strategy that protects self-esteem by preventing a full confrontation with one's abilities. Social withdrawal may not simply be shyness. It may be a way of avoiding the uncertainty of real engagement. Perfectionism may not simply be high standards. It may be a shield against criticism, because if nothing is ever finished, nothing can be judged. The reason this idea matters is that it opens a path to change. If a pattern is serving a purpose, then the relevant question is not just, how do I get rid of this feeling, but what am I trying to avoid or secure through it? That question creates clarity. It also creates responsibility. Because if a pattern is goal-directed, then continuing it is not merely passive. It is participation. This is one of the hardest truths in the book. We often do not cling to our misery because we enjoy it. We cling to it because it gives us a stable identity, a familiar script, or an excuse not to risk something greater. The philosopher asks the reader to consider that freedom is frightening precisely because it removes those protective structures. A freer life means a less defended life. Another major claim in the book is that all problems are interpersonal relationship problems. At first, this sounds exaggerated. Surely not every problem comes from other people. We experience loneliness, anxiety, shame, inadequacy, ambition, resentment, and self-doubt internally. Yet the philosopher's point is that these feelings are rarely isolated from the social world. They emerge in relation to real or imagined others. Consider shame. Shame is not just pain. It is pain tied to exposure, judgment, and imagined social rejection. Consider envy. Envy is comparison in emotional form. Consider loneliness. Loneliness is the felt absence of connection. Even the desire to achieve often carries an invisible audience in the background, people we want to impress, outgrow, silence, or surpass. The book does not mean that every difficulty is reducible to a single relationship conflict. It means that our emotional life is shaped by how we locate ourselves among other people. Do we see others as rivals, judges, authorities, or partners? Do we feel fundamentally beneath them, above them, or alongside them? The answers to those questions quietly determine a great deal of our happiness. This is why the book spends so much time on inferiority, superiority, and social comparison. Human beings suffer not only because life is difficult, but because they interpret their value through the eyes of others. A person may be capable, loved, and safe, and still live in torment if they believe they are failing in some social hierarchy. Another person may have many external challenges and yet remain inwardly stable because they do not measure their dignity by competition. The philosopher wants to show that much of our suffering comes from mistaken relational structures. We build vertical worlds where people are above and below us. We seek victory, recognition, and status. We fear disapproval because disapproval feels like demotion. We chase approval because approval feels like admission into safety. But if we can begin to see people horizontally, as fellow human beings rather than judges or opponents, something shifts. The pressure softens. We do not need to win existence. We do not need to dominate in order to matter. We do not need to perform superiority to avoid feeling small. This does not solve every problem instantly, but it transforms the emotional atmosphere in which problems are lived. The insight here is both subtle and profound. A large part of personal suffering is social suffering. To heal, then, we must not only manage our inner thoughts. We must rethink the very way we stand among others. The book treats inferiority feelings as one of the most common features of modern life. Nearly everyone knows what it feels like to compare themselves with someone more successful, more attractive, more confident, more admired, or more accomplished. In a culture organized around visible achievement, this comparison can become relentless. The philosopher does not say that inferiority feelings are inherently wrong. In fact, he argues that noticing our limitations can become a healthy source of aspiration. We realize there is distance between who we are and who we hope to become, and that awareness can motivate effort. The problem begins when inferiority hardens into a worldview. Then it becomes an inferiority complex. Instead of simply recognizing a gap and acting, a person concludes that the gap proves they are lesser as a human being. At that point, striving becomes poisoned. Effort gives way to self-protection. The person may withdraw, make excuses, or build elaborate narratives about why genuine action is impossible. The philosopher also points out that superiority complexes often grow out of the same soil. A person who constantly needs to appear impressive, powerful, special, or correct may actually be struggling with deep inferiority. Display becomes compensation. Arrogance becomes armor. The need to dominate becomes a defense against the terror of feeling small. This is why the book is so suspicious of competition as a basic way of organizing life. In competition, another person's success can feel like your failure. Their beauty becomes your lack. Their confidence becomes your insecurity. Their progress becomes a verdict on your stagnation. Once life becomes a race, peace becomes difficult, because there is always someone ahead. The philosopher wants to free the reader from this structure. He does not suggest giving up ambition or pretending differences do not exist. Instead, he argues that another person's path is not your task. Their gifts do not diminish your worth. Their success does not define your place. Comparison becomes destructive when it turns existence into ranking. The alternative is to focus on growth without making identity dependent on winning. A person can improve not to become superior, but to become more fully themselves. They can admire others without shrinking in front of them. They can pursue excellence without treating life as a contest for human value. This is one of the book's quiet revolutions. It says that peace does not come from finally outranking everyone who once intimidated you. It comes from no longer using comparison as the measure of your right to exist. Perhaps the most practical and widely quoted idea in The Courage to be Disliked is the separation of tasks. The philosopher presents it as a simple principle with transformative consequences. To separate tasks means to ask, whose responsibility is this? What is mine to carry, and what belongs to another person? This becomes crucial because so much emotional suffering comes from taking responsibility for what we cannot control. We want people to approve of us, agree with us, understand us, forgive us, admire us, or respond exactly as we hope. We become preoccupied with their judgments, their moods, and their interpretations. We try to manage their reactions through pleasing, over-explaining, apologizing, performing, or withdrawing. The philosopher says that this is where entanglement begins. Your task is to act honestly, thoughtfully, and responsibly. Their task is to evaluate you however they choose. You may influence their response, but you do not own it. Once you begin living inside another person's judgment, you surrender freedom. This principle is especially powerful because it reveals how often love and control become confused. Parents may say they are acting for a child's good while trying to control the child's choices. Adults may say they care deeply about harmony while quietly manipulating others to avoid discomfort. In work environments, people may overfunction constantly, not from generosity, but from fear of being disliked. The separation of tasks does not mean indifference. It does not mean becoming cold, rude, or irresponsible. It means refusing to live as though another person's emotional reaction is the final authority over your life. If you speak honestly and someone dislikes you, that dislike is their task. If you set a reasonable boundary and someone feels offended, their feeling is real, but it is not automatically your duty to erase it. If you pursue a path that matters to you and others disapprove, their disapproval does not invalidate your choice. This is why the title of the book matters so much. To be disliked is not the aim. The aim is to live truthfully enough that dislike no longer controls your decisions. The courage is not in provoking people. The courage is in accepting that honest living carries social risk. For many readers, this is the moment the book becomes intensely personal. Because once you begin separating tasks, you realize how much of your life may have been shaped by imagined audiences. You notice how often your anxiety is tied not to the action itself, but to the possibility of judgment. And with that recognition comes a new kind of freedom. The title of the book captures its most memorable lesson. Freedom and being disliked are deeply connected. The philosopher argues that any serious attempt to live according to your own values will eventually disappoint someone. You cannot become fully yourself while keeping every person comfortable. You cannot set honest boundaries while remaining universally approved. You cannot follow your convictions and guarantee that no one will judge, resist, or misunderstand you. This is where many people retreat. They would rather remain partially false than risk rejection. They would rather perform agreeableness than face conflict. They would rather stay trapped in pleasing than discover who they are without applause. The book suggests that this is one of the quiet tragedies of adult life. Many people trade freedom for acceptance and then wonder why they feel empty. The courage to be disliked is not a celebration of selfishness. It is not permission to ignore the needs of others or behave carelessly. The philosopher is not defending cruelty. He is defending independence from approval as a condition for genuine moral and emotional life. If every action is chosen to avoid criticism, then nothing is deeply chosen. There is also an important emotional realism here. The book does not pretend that being disliked feels pleasant. Rejection, misunderstanding, and disapproval can sting. But the philosopher asks us to compare two pains: the pain of temporary social discomfort and the deeper pain of lifelong self-betrayal. One is sharp but survivable. The other is quiet but corrosive. To live freely, then, is to accept that not everyone will affirm your choices. Some people benefit from your self-doubt. Some are attached to the version of you that stays small, compliant, and predictable. When you change, they may resist. The book encourages the reader not to treat that resistance as evidence of wrongdoing. Sometimes it is simply evidence that you are no longer organizing your life around everyone else's expectations. Freedom is expensive because it strips away excuses. Once you accept that approval is not the purpose of life, you are left with a more difficult question. What, then, will guide you? That question leads the book toward its next major theme, the idea of contribution and community feeling. A powerful thread running through the book is Adler's rejection of vertical relationships. In a vertical relationship, people are arranged in a hierarchy. Someone is above, someone is below. This can show up in obvious forms, like domination or submission, but it can also appear in everyday interactions that seem normal. Praise, for example, is treated critically in the book because praise often assumes the praiser occupies a higher position, evaluating another person's behavior from above. Instead, the philosopher argues for horizontal relationships, relationships built on equality. In a horizontal relationship, we do not stand over others as judges, nor do we stand beneath them as dependents seeking permission. We meet each other as fellow human beings. This changes the emotional quality of interaction. Encouragement replaces praise because encouragement does not imply superiority. It says, I recognize your effort, your struggle, your direction, without claiming ownership over your worth. Respect replaces control because respect allows another person to remain separate and equal. Dialogue replaces command. This way of thinking has profound implications for parenting, teaching, leadership, and friendship. So many relationships become distorted when one side needs to feel superior in order to feel secure. People correct unnecessarily, advise excessively, or withhold affirmation because hierarchy gives them psychological safety. On the other side, many people remain overly dependent because obedience feels safer than autonomy. The philosopher wants to undo both roles. Equality, in this sense, is not sameness of ability or circumstance. It is sameness of dignity. Another person may know more than you, earn more than you, or perform better than you in some field, but they are not above you in worth. Likewise, you do not become more human by outranking them. This may sound idealistic, but it is deeply practical. The more we see others as rivals or judges, the more anxious and defensive we become. The more we see them as fellow participants in life, the less energy we spend on performance. Equality softens fear. It makes contribution possible. It allows intimacy without domination and respect without submission. For all its emphasis on freedom and independence, The Courage to be Disliked is not a book about isolation. It does not end with the individual cutting everyone off and declaring absolute self-definition. Instead, it moves toward a fuller idea of belonging, one Adler called community feeling. This is the sense that one is connected to others, part of a larger whole, and capable of contributing meaningfully. This is essential because the book does not want to free the reader from approval only to leave them stranded in self-absorption. It wants to free them from vanity, comparison, and dependence so that they can participate more honestly in life with others. Contribution becomes the healthier alternative to recognition. Recognition asks, do they see me as valuable? Contribution asks, how am I participating in the shared world? Recognition keeps attention fixed on the self. Contribution redirects attention outward without erasing the self. It says that meaning is found not by obsessing over whether you're impressive, but by engaging usefully and sincerely with life around you. The philosopher suggests that people experience genuine happiness when they feel, in some quiet way, that they are of use. This does not require grand achievement. It does not require fame, status, or extraordinary talent. Contribution can be humble. It may exist in work done with care, in listening well, in raising a child without domination, in helping a colleague, in creating something honest, or in showing up responsibly. What matters is not the scale, but the orientation. A person consumed by self-evaluation often becomes paralyzed. Am I enough? Am I failing? Am I admired? Am I ahead? These questions spiral endlessly. But when attention shifts toward contribution, a different kind of stability becomes possible. One no longer needs to prove worth every moment, because worth is not being measured competitively. The book's vision of happiness is therefore relational, but not dependent in the needy sense. It says that human beings thrive when they feel connected and useful, not when they dominate or disappear. This is one of the most mature aspects of the book. It recognizes that the cure for unhealthy self-consciousness is not inflated self-esteem. It is participation in something larger than the anxious self. The philosopher repeatedly returns to the danger of living for recognition. This pursuit can take many forms. Some people want admiration. Some want approval. Some want to avoid criticism so intensely that they make themselves agreeable in every possible situation. Others want to be seen as exceptional, wise, strong, or morally superior. Beneath these variations lies the same dependence. Self-worth is outsourced to the reactions of others. The problem with this way of living is not merely that other people are unpredictable, although they are. The deeper problem is that approval becomes a governing principle. It begins to shape decisions long before we notice it. We choose work that looks respectable rather than work that feels meaningful. We say what will be accepted rather than what is true. We remain in relationships that shrink us because being chosen feels safer than being alone. We imitate instead of creating. The book insists that this dependence is one of the central barriers to freedom. If your peace depends on being well regarded, then anyone can control you by withholding approval. Praise becomes intoxicating, criticism becomes devastating, and authenticity becomes difficult. The philosopher's alternative is not to stop caring completely about others. Human beings are social creatures, and connection matters. Rather, the challenge is to stop making recognition the source of your legitimacy. Your life cannot be built around the hope that enough applause will finally make you secure. This insight is especially relevant in a world where visibility is often confused with worth. The logic of comparison and performance has only intensified in modern culture. The book's message cuts against that logic. It says you do not become free by managing your image more skillfully. You become free by caring less about image as the basis of existence. That is why the courage to be disliked is inseparable from the courage to be ordinary. Not ordinary in the sense of insignificant, but ordinary in the sense of no longer needing to be exceptional to deserve a place in the world. One of the subtler but most profound themes in the book is the courage to be ordinary. Many people hear this phrase and misunderstand it. It sounds like a call to mediocrity, passivity, or giving up ambition. But that is not what the philosopher means. The courage to be ordinary means giving up the fantasy that your worth depends on being special in a comparative sense. From childhood onward, many people are taught, directly or indirectly, that to matter they must stand out. They must be smarter, more admired, more talented, more unique, or more accomplished than others. This creates a hidden panic. If I am not exceptional, then who am I? If I do not shine, then do I disappear? The book challenges this fear. It says that the desire to be special often hides a fear of insignificance. And that fear becomes exhausting. It makes ordinary human limits feel humiliating. It makes other people's success feel threatening. It turns life into a constant audition. To be ordinary, in the Adlerian sense, is to accept that one does not need superiority in order to possess dignity. One does not need to be the center. One does not need a dramatic identity to justify existence. There is extraordinary freedom in this. When the need to be exceptional loosens, attention can return to the actual work of living. This does not kill excellence. In fact, it may make excellence healthier. A person can pursue mastery without turning it into a verdict on their humanity. They can care deeply about their work without making that work a rescue mission for their self-worth. They can admire greatness without needing to become superior. The courage to be ordinary is a quiet courage because it involves surrendering a fantasy many people never question. It asks whether you can live meaningfully without being special in the eyes of the world. And it suggests that the answer is yes, not because your life is small, but because human value was never meant to be ranked that way in the first place. Another important lesson in the book concerns time, specifically the tendency to postpone life. Many people live as though their real life will begin later. After they become more successful. After they are healed enough. After they achieve recognition. After they resolve every flaw. After they arrive at some imagined state of worthiness. Until then, the present becomes a waiting room. The philosopher challenges this way of living. He suggests that life is not a line we climb toward a final destination of validation. It is a series of moments in which we choose how to live now. This perspective does not deny planning or long-term effort. It denies the idea that meaning lives only in the future. This matters because waiting can become a subtle form of avoidance. If you believe your life starts later, then you do not have to engage fully today. You can explain your hesitation by saying, "Not yet. I still need to become someone else first." The book questions this postponement. It asks whether life might already be here in its unfinished form, asking not for perfection, but for participation. To live in the present, then, is not to become careless or impulsive. It is to stop using the future as a hiding place. It is to recognize that dignity is expressed in the way one inhabits the current moment, not merely in some eventual outcome. This idea connects beautifully with the rest of the book. If you stop organizing your worth around recognition, stop postponing life until you are exceptional, and stop letting the past define the present, then what remains is the task of living honestly today. That may be in small acts, speaking clearly, working sincerely, relating respectfully, contributing quietly, and choosing courage in the next available moment. The philosopher's message is not that life becomes easy. It is that life becomes immediate. And in that immediacy, freedom stops being a theory and becomes a practice. What does all of this look like in practice? The power of the courage to be disliked lies partly in how easily its ideas can be applied to everyday life. In work, for example, the separation of tasks can help clarify where responsibility ends. You can prepare well, communicate clearly, and act with integrity. But you cannot control every interpretation, every opinion, or every preference others bring to the table. Once you understand that, anxiety loses some of its grip. In friendships and family relationships, the book encourages healthier boundaries. Instead of trying to manage everyone else's feelings, you learn to distinguish care from control. You can be compassionate without taking ownership of another adult's entire emotional world. You can disagree without guilt becoming automatic. You can love people without organizing your entire identity around keeping them satisfied. In romantic relationships, the book challenges dependence disguised as devotion. Many people think love means constant approval, emotional fusion, or endless accommodation. The philosopher's framework suggests something more respectful: closeness without control, commitment without domination, intimacy without the collapse of selfhood. For personal growth, the book offers a direct challenge to excuse-making. It asks us to notice where our self-descriptions protect us from risk. Are we calling ourselves broken when what we really fear is failure? Are we calling ourselves shy when what we fear is being seen? Are we calling ourselves perfectionists when what we fear is ordinary imperfection judged by others? Even communication changes under this framework. Encouragement becomes more important than praise. Listening becomes more important than correcting. Equality becomes more important than authority. We begin to ask not, how do I get people to behave the way I want, but how do I relate in a way that respects both their dignity and my own? These applications do not create an effortless life. In many cases, they make life initially harder because honesty is harder than performance and boundaries are harder than pleasing. But over time, they produce a more stable form of peace. One becomes less scattered by opinion, less governed by comparison, and less dependent on recognition. That is the practical promise of the book. Not comfort, but clarity. Not social smoothness at any cost, but integrity. Not approval from everyone, but greater freedom in the life you are actually living. The courage to be disliked endures because it offers a difficult but deeply compelling vision of freedom. It tells us that much of what we call fate is often habit, strategy, fear, or self-protection. It tells us that the past matters, but does not have to become destiny. It tells us that relationships shape our suffering, but also our healing. It tells us that comparison is a poor foundation for identity, and that approval is too unstable to serve as the center of a life. Most importantly, it tells us that happiness is not found in superiority, image, or constant affirmation. It is found in living with courage, in relating to others as equals, in separating what is ours from what is not, and in contributing to the shared world without making recognition the price of self-respect. This is a demanding message because it removes many familiar excuses. But it is also an unusually generous one. It gives the reader back something that fear, comparison, and social performance often steal: agency. It says that even now, even before perfect confidence, even before complete healing, even before universal approval, a person can begin to live differently. And perhaps that is the book's deepest challenge. Not whether we agree with every claim, but whether we are willing to ask ourselves a more honest question. If freedom were available, would we accept the loneliness, responsibility, and uncertainty that come with it? Or have we become so accustomed to the safety of explanation that we no longer know how to choose? The courage to be disliked is, in the end, the courage to live without asking the world for constant permission. It is the courage to be ordinary, to be equal, to be responsible, and to belong through contribution rather than performance. It is not an easy courage. But according to this book, it may be the beginning of a truly free life.